Alright, Chapter 14, Video 2. Things are going not well, for anyone, it seems. Dr. Christine stood on his porch, looking through the forest at the blur where the sea melted into the petrified sky. He had just come back from the Ellicott house. In the few minutes he had had alone with Slally, the little girl had answered with an emphatic nod, when Dr. Christine asked her if Bentley had found out anything about the stone. He has, perhaps, discovered where this animal took it. Slally had nodded again. Ellen Drake told the old man that Polly Woodhouse had telephoned from the police station to report that the search for the missing boy was moving to the uplands beyond Pensionville. So, Dr. Christine said to himself, we will hope that these good men do not find him too soon. Every droplet of mist, every gleaming leaf of the forest, and each bird cry that splintered the morning's silence conveyed an ephemeral sense of waiting and expectancy. For once, Herr Prince, you and I are both doing the same thing. Dietrich Christine said, but we do not hope for the same conclusion. Ellen bent over and kissed Slally on the top of her head. Don't cry, she whispered. She took Slally's face in both her hands. It's a secret, isn't it? Slally nodded. If you won't cry any more because you can't tell, I won't cry any more because I was horrible to Richard and because I'm worried sick about Bentley. Slally wiped her eyes on the edge of Ellen's robe. We're going to find him, Ellen told her. We'll make a bet. I'll bet that Bentley's home before lunch. She heard Richard's car turn at the driveway. Slally slid off her chair and went out into the living room. Ellen ran her fingers through her hair and prayed for such grace that never again would she have to practice sentences to convince the only man she'd ever loved that she loved him. Richard's footsteps sounded on the front porch. The screen door banged shut. Ellen tightened the belt of her bathrobe and went out into the hall. Richard was standing in the living room. He looked exhausted. They haven't found him, he said to Slally. Ellen's heart ached for him. He was beaten. She couldn't remember the words that would make everything all right again. But she tried. Richard, darling. He raised his head and looked at her. Just shut up and go, he told her. Then he went upstairs and slammed the bedroom door. Ombra was the delusion, the foretelling, and their fate. Bentley opened his eyes. He was lying with his cheek on the grass. An ant was struggling along a few inches from his nose, tugging a morsel as big as itself. Thoughts started to brighten in Bentley's mind like the foggy day around him. He watched the ant stagger over a broken stalk of grass. Its legs flailed as it hauled its burden through a tangle of fibers and dust. It was oblivious to anything except its destination. Bentley's brain began to fill with memory. He sat up. He didn't want to watch the ant anymore because it made him feel ashamed about giving up. He didn't want to remember either. The memory of Mr. Tally and what he'd said about Bentley's mother was too terrible to think about. Bentley sat on the grass, feeling an empty ache in his stomach and a bitter taste in his mouth. He raised his head. Mist was passing over him and all around him, rolling in gentle, silent billows. He squinted at the sky. A bright spot in it told him that the sun was high and the morning already partly gone. At home, they'd have finished breakfast by now. His father and Ellen would be really sore at him for running away. He lowered his head. He was still a little stupid with sleep. He sat staring at his sneakers out on the ends of his legs. He couldn't forget what Mr. Tally had said. He felt grief filling him. He sat in the white, billowing silence looking at his feet. If he quit and went home, Dr. Christine would probably give up on him because he wasn't going to be a hero anymore. McGraw, who'd been responsible for finding him, would go back to thinking Bentley was crazy. Slally would be mad because he'd made her promise not to tell where he was going, and that had probably gotten her into a lot of trouble. The stillness of the place where he sat pressed in on him. The rolling fog passed through, taking with it the minutes of the day and all the things people were doing, and Bentley was being left behind. His empty stomach hurt. The other emptiness swelled with a bleakness that made him think of his house with nobody in it. He sniffed. He wiped his eyes with the ends of his fingers. He rubbed his nose on his sleeve and raised his head, realizing he couldn't sit there on the grass forever. The wind that drove the mist sighed and strengthened. As Bentley watched, the fog in front of him began to thin out. He could see a jagged wall emerging from the white. That would be a stand of pine trees. He heard the wind fluttering in his ears. He saw more of the grass stubble emerging from the haze beyond his sneakers. He saw a human shape standing on a hummock 100 yards to his right. Bentley jumped to his feet. Then he yelled, "Hey, I'm over here!" The figure didn't gesture or approach. It didn't move. The smoky shape looked like a man standing with one hand on his hip as he watched Bentley. The mist was still too thick for Bentley to make out the man's face or the color of his clothes. Bentley cupped his hand around his mouth and shouted as loud as he could, "I'm over here!" The smoke man didn't move. Bentley dropped his hands to his sides. The figure on the hummock wasn't somebody out looking for a lost boy. Bentley stared. His scalp prickled. The skin on his face began to tighten. The figure stood motionless, staring back at him. A knot began to harden beneath Bentley's breastbone, above his stomach, as it dawned on him whom he was looking at. "I'm not scared of you," he said in a small voice. "I've still got my magic, and you—" He peered up at the sky. The sun was brighter in the dissipating mist. Bentley heard his hawks whistle twice, as if to reassure him that they were still there. He imagined their bodies circling close above his head. He looked back at the man on the hummock. He hadn't changed his stance. "You can't make me do anything," Bentley yelled. "I've still got my magic. I don't have to fight or do anything else I don't want to." Fog drifted past the silhouetted figure. It dimmed for a moment and then solidified again. Bentley remembered why he was out there all alone watching it. He remembered Helga lying in the forest. He remembered Mr. Tally in the firelight, and the poison that had infected him years before. The same poison had turned Bentley's mother ugly. Now she was dead, and the clergyman Bentley thought had loved him was worse than dead. "Bastard!" he yelled suddenly at the smoke man. "I'm going to find that stone. I know where it is, and when I find it, I'm going to kill you, bastard!" He tightened his fists. He wasn't sad anymore. He was filled with the fury of getting even. He ran. He ran across the grass stubble toward the wall of pine trees. He dashed in among them, limping hard, jumping over logs and running faster on the springy floor of pine needles. He dodged around the trees, going deeper into the woods. When he finally stopped, he was gasping, his heart was pounding, and he was furious. He turned around and pushed his brown hair out of his eyes. He couldn't see the open country anymore. He couldn't see anybody following him. He turned back and started walking the way he figured the bobcat had gone, toward Indian Hill. Standing on the hummock in the open field, Willie Bill looked with glittering jade eyes at the facade of forest where Bentley had disappeared. The sun grew stronger. It glowed with an extra power that was not its own. It murdered the low-hanging vapor, and by noon the day was clear. Heat shimmered on roads, distorting the images that lay beyond them. The police station was suffocating. Flies buzzed on the window glass. The radio sputtered after McGraw had finished speaking. Dick Amberstam paused a moment before replying. His face was sweaty and gray. He pressed the microphone button. "You got no choice but to keep trying," he said. The static on the radio grew louder. "That's what we're doing," McGraw's voice answered through the sputters and crackling. "As long as it takes. Barney's gone north, in the chopper." Dick replaced the microphone on its hook. Polly was sitting at the table beside him. Her round face was flushed and shining in the heat. She put her head on her folded arms and wept. Mrs. Tally stood at her living room window, watching Steve Slattery walk past her house, down toward the wharf in the breathless afternoon. Steve was a nice boy, she thought peevishly. Why couldn't Polly have taken up with a decent young man like him? Ombra had disembodied himself. He had become earth, air, fire, and water. With the dreaded one commingling in its heat, the sun slid from its apex. It blazed and dazzled on the first curve of the afternoon. Steve stood on the wharf, watching Ellen and Slally walk toward him. He could see Slally's upper body through her flimsy shirt as the sun burned behind him. Steve looked at her bare legs. The power that supercharged the sun had rendered Steve Slattery's mind, melting away everything he thought, knew, and believed, everything that restrained him. His desire had become flushed and irrational in the heat. He smiled at Ellen because he was grateful to her for producing a child who could never tell. "Come on, Sally," he said. "Today you're going to help me put on the sails." "Are you sure you don't mind keeping her for the afternoon?" Ellen asked. Steve picked up a sail bag and slung it over his shoulder. "It's a pleasure, Mrs. Drake. Me and Sally get along fine." Sally looked up at him. "Thank you," Ellen said. "I'll pick her up about 5. She watched Sally climbing into the dinghy that was tied to the float. Sally had wanted to stay home, but Ellen had to get her out of the house. The situation with Richard was desperate, and Ellen needed to be alone with him. She walked back to her car and started the engine. Her anxieties about Bentley, the dread that tightened in her each time the telephone rang during that interminable morning, and everything was compounded and intensified by the stifling heat. Richard lay alone in their bedroom. He had refused to speak to her, aside from his fierce command that she shut up and go, or even acknowledge her since he had come home early that morning. When she went upstairs to dress, he had been lying with his face turned toward the wall. Ellen had gathered up her clothes and hairbrush quietly so as not to awaken him. As she'd left the bedroom, she'd seen that his eyes were open. She drove through the village, crossed the highway, and turned into the dirt road that led through the forest on the point. The cicadas were shrilling in the thick foliage. They sounded infuriated. Ellen understood that she had wounded Richard with her outburst of despair over Sally. Yet, surely, he knew that she didn't mean it. After their quarrel during the thunderstorm, he had surmounted his own anger to be forgiving. This time it was different. He had been transformed. Ellen knew intuitively that the fury was coming from somewhere outside of him. Richard had become a lens that was focusing an inhuman rage on her. She was terrified by the malevolence that was expressing itself through him. She parked her car in the driveway, crossed the porch, and went upstairs. Her hand was shaking as she opened the bedroom door. I think we're going to stop the video there and do the second half of the chapter tomorrow.